I'm starting the streaming on the channel. I'm start. So I see there are plenty of people in the class, 37. Okay. So the lecture of today is a second introductory lecture on environmental impact assessment class. Today, we shall start by introducing some terminology and discuss some fundamental concepts of the environmental impact assessment procedure. As you can imagine, I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
Yes, we can.
Yes.
As you can imagine, the key word is the wraparound concept impact, for which we shall give some definition. Shall start by here. What is an environmental impact? The environmental impact can be defined as the effect of an anthropic intervention which causes deterioration of individual environmental components or an environmental system as a whole. More precisely, we may say that an environmental impact is the result of interferences caused by an initial source through chains of more or less complex events generating pressures on significant environmental targets. What we will subsequently call environmental components, gradient pressures on significant environmental targets or components with the potential to alter them. There is a very general definition that can be drawn from the OECD drafting of environmental impact assessment procedure back in the 70s of last century. In general, we may generalize the concept of environmental impact by sketching the source, but maybe an elementary action. So from the point of view of environmental engineer, maybe, I don't know, movements, land movements for digging a landfill, or it might be construction of iron pillars for an electroduct, or maybe building of a portion of road and so on. These are all elementary actions that may be seen as source of impact. This elementary action may cause by direct interference an changement or an impact on a primary environmental target. We will subsequently call these environmental components, and this as a consequence may have an impact to the environmental systems as a whole. So the basic idea is that of an action, elementary action by man, causes a direct interference on a primary environmental target, and then this causes damages or changement on the environmental system. When starting to identify environmental components, it is useful to start categorizing. You know, I am a systematic, so I like very much to draft out categories and try to fill all my concepts into categories. For example, environmental categories may be atmosphere, air, The water environment, meaning as in large terms, so, sea, rivers, lakes, but also groundwater and so on, soil and subsoil, vegetation, flora and fauna, ecosystems in general, public health, and this is the anthropogenic perspective, noise and vibration, again anthropogenic, landscape is an environmental characteristic or an environmental perspective, but is the focus of ecologists in general. Ionizing and non-ionizing radiations, these are the general environmental categories as they were introduced by the OECD, in the 70s of last century. Another important concept, besides that of environmental categories, is that of environmental risk. Linked with the concept of impact is also, from a technical viewpoint, but the concept of risk. An environmental risk may be in some way considered a potential impact, but let's say it is a particular flavor of a concept of environmental impact. It is a way of looking at the effect in terms of risk. Risk may be seen as a potential impact. Risk means that it is not certain, but this will happen, but there are some probabilities and some conditions in which this will happen. We will have some discussion about environmental risk on the second part of the course. Particularly, I think it will be Alberto Barausi that will introduce this concept. So, when you start to deal with an environmental impact assessment problem, the first thing you typically, as an environmental engineer, the environmental engineer is the subject that is responsible for carrying out the procedure, is that of identifying the impacts. This is not trivial, of course, as we will see, might be highly subjective, and a large part of effort of the methodologies that I'm trying to introduce in this class have the scope of trying to make these choices the most objective as possible, so less subjective. First starting point is that of being consistent with the regulations. So this is why, as you will see, we will have a couple of lectures strictly on regulations, because you as an environmental engineer shall be able to read the regulation in order to get a guideline on which are the impacts you should identify. So you have to be consistent with regulation. You have to provide a comprehensive picture of the impact, so you have to include as most impacts as you can. Then you have to be able to distinguish between impacts that are positive or negative. For example, a positive impact may be that of reforestation, planting trees. Negative impact may be that of cutting forests. You may also, you should also be able to identify if the impacts are extended or limited, extended in space and time or limited in space and time. So you should introduce a kind of scaling. You shall introduce a kind of scaling also in terms of time, long-term or short-term impact. You shall identify those impacts that are reversible or irreversible, those impacts that are significant or not. Significant, of course, it is a subjective concept, but for somebody, one impact may be significant, for somebody else, maybe not. You shall be able to identify these impacts are direct or secondary. But the key point is that the identification of impacts by the construction of an evaluation matrix should allow comparison between different alternatives. So what we are doing here, we are trying to evaluate different project alternatives. So we are not really questioning if we have or not, we have not to implement something, but instead we are comparing different ways of implement some kind of construction or human manufacture. And the impact evaluation should be a guideline to build some kind of ranking between different alternatives. Typically, when you do identification of impacts, you may incorporate in your description information that is both qualitative or quantitative, with a standard de facto, or it is a condition that is unavoidable. What I mean by qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative, I mean, if I can put numbers, so this impact is very relevant or less relevant. You may decide that less relevant is 0 and very relevant is 10. So you have already introduced a kind of scaling or kind of score system. But often, and this is often the case in environmental issues, it may be also qualitative. So you may use smileys, so or smileys, so sad faces, or you may use ambiguous words like good or bad, or healthy or not healthy, and so on. But this is the case, not necessarily the case when you have to do with the feeling human or societal interpretation of real system observation. So what is environmental impact assessment? Well, we have made a lot of talks without saying anything specific. Environmental impact assessment. Now we start to go into the technical part. It is an administrative and technical procedure aimed at formulating an assessment of compatibility of a new construction and or substantial changes to the environment understood as the set of human activities and natural resources. So here we have two categories: human activities that somehow influences the environment in terms of natural resources. So environmental impact environmental impact assessment has to do with the crossing of activities due to man actions and the effect of these activities on the environment. Environmental impact assessment identifies and describes the states of fact. So starts by observing the actual situation and evaluates the design stage. So makes an evaluation of what man society would implement. So it is the design stage. It is based on a forecast of possible disruptive effects of initial environmental situation or the impact generated by the achievement of the project. So again, when we talk about forecasts, you may understand that we are thinking about models. So what we will discuss in this class are a set of methodologies and models that may be applied to environmental situation, to environmental systems in order to evaluate the effect of human activities. What are the objectives of this procedure? The objective of environmental impact assessment procedure is at assessing and comparing solutions through analysis of different alternatives, allowing to achieve the goal targeted by the work. So we accept, in principle, that we have a target. We accept the target is what shall be realized for human society, and we would like to implement this target by minimize the effects on the environment, and we minimize the effects on the environment by evaluating different alternatives. So different ways of implementing the work for the goal targeted. Purpose in this context is prevention and protection of the environment consistent with the needs of economic development. Again, here there is an important concept in this sentence, and the concept is that we recognize that our society needs a boost towards economic development, but due to the concept of sustainability compatibility as introduced on Tuesday, we shall implement a prevention and protection perspective. Prevention of let's say, unavoidable damages to the environment and protection of the environment as a whole. Let's give a look at a brief history of how environmental impact assessment come into play. We found this concept, environmental impact assessment, introduced as an instrument of Environmental Policy Act in the US law with the National Environmental Policy Act, the so-called NEPA, in 1969. As often it happens, it was the United States that first, through the Environmental Protection Agency, or the National Environmental Protection Agency, introduced this concept of environmental impact assessment. In Europe, we have to wait decades, 1966, in which in France, we first find les études d'impact for operations that can have disruptive effects on the environment. When I talk 1966 and I think of France, in my head, there is a light that is OECD. It is the Organization for the Economic Development. L'Organizzazione Europea per lo Sviluppo Economico, OECD Economic Development. Sorry. Okay. Then we have to wait until 1977 to see the concept of environmental impact clearly introduced into the European legislation. It is the second program of a community environmental action that indicates as an objective the creation of mechanisms to ensure preventive action toward the protection of the environment. Then the starting point of all this story is 1985, in which the European Community adopted the first Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, Directive 85/337, environmental impact assessment of certain projects, public or private, to be implemented by 1988. So this is the story. The story starts back in the late 60s, early 70s, United States and then France. And then we have in the beginning of the 80s, the first European directives. And as you may know, European directives obliges member states to implement these directives in their national legislation. And the idea in 1985 was to be implemented in 1988. Then there's some subtle variation of these concepts. In 1997, it was introduced a second directive, a very important 97 number 11 European Community, referring only to projects of works. The most important innovation is the inclusion of the screening phase, so a selection which allows to decide which of the projects for which environmental impact assessment is not mandatory should, however, be submitted to the procedure. What does this sentence mean? This sentence means that if you read the directive of 95, you will see that in the annexes there are lists of projects that may be exempted by undergoing an environmental impact assessment procedure. This means that the environmental impact assessment procedure for certain projects or works is not mandatory. However, in 97, it was recognized that this setting was too loose, and so it has to be refined a little bit. So they introduced the screening phase. The screening phase that is introduced by Directive 97 aims at selecting those projects or actions that, even if containing the list of exempted from the environmental impact assessment by the directive of 1985, they shall however, undergo to the procedure. Why this is so significant, the screening phase? Because as it will be clear by the end of this class, environmental impact assessment is a very cumbersome, time-consuming, economically money-consuming procedure. So the idea is that, okay, we want to protect the environment, but we cannot stop by doing anything for environmental protection. Instead, we shall be careful in at least protect the environment when there are some actions that are significantly potentially modifying in a dramatic way the condition of environment. Then there is another important turning point, that is in 2001, in which we have directive number 42, 2001, the third key directive on environmental impact assessment, in which the concept of strategic environmental appraisal was introduced. So, the strategic environmental appraisal, it is a procedure that is not related to project of individual works, but in reality is an evaluation on assessment of the effect of particular plans and programs. So during strategic environmental appraisal, what member states do is guarantee that their development plans are consistent with the environmental impact assessment requirement. So it is at another level, strategic environmental appraisal concerns plans and non-particular or specific projects, instead development plans. For example, in Italian, piano d'ambito territoriale, territorial ambit plan. It's a plan. When the plan, such kind of plans shall be adopted, then in order to guarantee that these plans are consistent with the environmental impact assessment, they should undergo strategic environmental appraisal. So the difference is in terms of timing and in terms also of type of types of projects that shall undergo this directive. The environmental impact assessment has been then implemented in Italy by the law 349 1986, which addressed the issues in very general terms, leaving the definition of the details in subsequent legislation. Please note that, I don't know in the other countries, but at least in Italy, was law 349 of 1986. It is the law that introduces the Ministry of Environment. So before 1986, we did not have a Ministry of Environment in Italy. So you can imagine that at least in Italy, at a national level, 1986 is a key point, a key moment. What are we involved? Which are the involved subjects? The environmental impact assessment is a procedure that involves three major players. The first one is the proposer or the developer of the work. It is the proposer that requests the authorization to make a particular work and justifies the choice through the production of what? An environmental impact study. Environmental impact study is the central document that the environmental engineers or the team produces when carrying an environmental impact assessment procedure. Law tends to distinguish between the developer and the proponent. In general, in Veneto region, law states that the developer is private while the proposing authority is a public subject, but these are just nuisances connected to the meaning of word, of course. Proposer and developer may be seen as synonyms, but let's say that proposer and developer are those subjects that are interested or in charge of the realization of the work. The second key subject is the public administration, what is called to verify the adequacy of a project and to evaluate the environmental impact study submitted by the proposer. So it is up to the proposer to draft this document. Environmental impact studies are enormous, very large, heavy documents, thousands of pages, in which the proposer tries to justify to all the public administration the choices, the alternative we have chosen to realize or to implement a particular opera. And the third subject, and this is really the turning point, is the population involved. Before 1986, I don't have examples of laws in which it was explicitly stated by the fact that the public had the right to participate to the decision. So the population involved may directly or through representatives of political parties, association delegates, and so on, may interfere in the decision in various ways. They may ask to reject, approve, or change or request changes to the draft. Please note that this is the very key point. It is a question that I always pose at the exam. What is the most innovative part of environmental impact assessment legislation? To my understanding, to my knowledge, is that the public is explicitly called to intervene into the decision, and not only called, but it is also formalized strictly and very definitely how the public may intervene into the decision. Environmental impact study. What is the environmental impact study? The environmental impact study environmental impact study scope is that of documenting the studies conducted by the proposer in order to assess the effects of the proposed work on the environmental system with reference to components, environmental components, factors, relations between factors and components, and the quality state of the concerned area. So the environmental impact study is a description of the status de facto of the environment and a description of the work to be implemented and a description of the alternatives selected. Must be drawn in accordance with the requirements of the following frameworks: planning or programmatic. So they have, the first step is that of looking into planning tools that was stated through the environmental, through the strategic environmental appraisal, la VAS in italiano, valutazione ambientale strategica. So the first step is verifying that the plan, that the project has been developed in accordance with the planning or programmatic, evaluating the designing, so the project, the way the opera shall be implemented, and evaluating the environmental conditions. So the three key frameworks are planning, design, and environmental. Then, in the environmental impact study, there should be a discussion of the various alternatives. First matter one may deal with is a strategic aspect, the search for the design, alternatives for the realization of the same project or the same objective. When you present an environmental impact assessment procedure through the environmental impact study document, it is expected that you shall discuss also all the possible alternatives to the realization proposed for the process. Then there is an evaluation of the localization that is necessary in planning work. a discussion of alternative process or structure that are useful in the general context or executive design. Then the document environmental impact studies should also contain clearing and mitigation measures that are useful during the executive design, and in particular, that are useful in the decommissioning phase. So what's going on if we destroy or disassemble the plant? And then there is also an important discussion about what's called zero alternative. That is a kind of introduction or feasibility study. In practice, the study of zero alternative indicates the need of a project. What if we are not going to realize this particular project? So in the environmental impact studies, between the alternatives, you shall also include the zero alternative. If we do not realize the project, then the consequences of the environment may be these and those. Okay, what are the possible goals of an environmental impact study? Choose the minimum impact of the work among more than one project and more than one site. So this is an allocation and optimal choice problem. Choose the work with a minimal impact among more than one project for a single site. This is an optimal choice of project alternatives. Choose between a single project and more than one site. This is again an optimal allocation problem. Assess the environmental eligibility of a single project for a single site, so remediableness of the project. Rate the level of environmental acceptability of a work already allocated or for which has already been decided on the creation or allocation, and so on. So you understand that all these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 goals has to do with the discussion, justification of possible choices or the choices between possible alternatives. So it is really a matter of decision problem. It is a decision problem. This is why we shall have next week an introduction to decision theory that will guide us toward the discussion of the more common decision support models like the multi-criteria analysis and so on. So it is a decision theory problem. What is the general structure of environmental impact study? As we said, programmatic framework. So what was planned for this area? What are the scope? What has been accepted by strategic environmental appraisal? Thus, a discussion of the design framework. So how will be build the opera and so on, and an environmental framework. What are the conditions of the environmental system in which the construction will be implemented? In the programmatic framework, there is a reconstruction of the programmatic and planning scenario in the project area. As I told you, this has to do with strategic environmental appraisal. And then the programmatic framework, there is an analysis between the relationship between the proposed intervention and the territorial and sectorial planning and scheduling acts, like for example, the general urban plan GUP. So during the programmatic framework, you shall verify that your project is consistent with, for example, the general urban plan or the territorial ambit plan, impact, and all these planning tools that have been foreseen and has been put out during the strategic environmental appraisal. In the designing framework, there is a discussion of the reasons assumed by the proposal in the definition of initiative. There is an evaluation of the technological choices of the project. So here you start discussing alternatives, identify the causes of interference with the environment. as measured in various stages of the project: construction, operation, malfunction, and decommissioning. So in the designing framework, all these causes of interference may be evaluated. The environmental framework instead analyzes the natural and anthropic components, I call you environmental components, affected by the project and the interaction between them and the environmental system taken as a whole. Also, in this framework, to be described, the impacts of different nature related to the new infrastructure, measures for a correct integration into the landscape and the ecosystem. For example, when you project a highway that is crossing a forest, normally what you do as environmental engineer, you project also crossings, allowing animals to pass from one side to the other of the highway without risking of dying because of the vehicles that are running on the highway. So it is a kind of containment measures of the integration of the operant to the landscape. Containment measure of the possible impacts related to emission of pollutants, because of course environmental impact assessment has to do in a significant way with the emission of pollutants, measures of compensation and restoration of sites, monitoring measures, and established control procedures. So all these should be discussed into the environmental framework. You understand why the environmental impact study is growing, and becoming a several kilograms papers documents, but are the output of a group of experts and policymakers, but also public opinioners and decision makers, that may be very large. So this may be the result of the cooperation of hundreds of people, depending on the dimension of the project, and the scope of the project, of course. Information. The organization of an environmental impact study requires a rational managing of information flows. This information should be quantitatively important and qualitatively consistent. This means that when you're drafting an environmental impact study, you have to include a lot of information quantitatively, but you also have to include information of good quality, so consistent. This means, this is written in between the lines, that the task, the group in charge of drafting environmental impact study shall be composed by several specialists of the various sectors. For example, if your project is about the implementation of a glass factory or a glass molding plant, then you will have industrial engineers in the group, experts of the material glass, experts of resources needed for finding silicate for building glass, expert of the processes of glass molding. So you see, the information should be provided by very prepared specialists. Then all this information has to be documented. So the documentation is obtained through technical documents, the environmental impact study itself, and the various design scripts, but also, as you will see later, by non-technical documents that are aimed at informing the public. So you need a non-technical summary and documentation certifying the publication of the acts. As we will see when discussing the procedure, there is all a series of required tasks to be carried by the proposer in order to be sure that the public at large has all the information it needs to intervene into the decision. This, of course, requires the production of non-technical documents that may be read by the public at large. It is important, while drafting environmental impact study, the selection of the right terminology, the adoption of a clear terminology in terms of semantic associated with jargon is particularly important because, especially in this sector, the use of an understandable but precise technical language is a definite priority. So we must create a kind of bridge between disciplines, a common language. It is the environmental impact study. It is a document that has been drafted by a large team of multidisciplinary experts. Every expert speaks its own language, and an effort shall be made, and this is typically the proposer or the drafter, but an effort shall be made in order to find a common terminology so that everybody may understand what we are talking about. Now let's finish with this lecture by discussing a little bit more about impacts of this quite ambiguous word. What are impacts? We may say impacts are interference on the systems, but may be direct or indirect. So we are here introducing some terminology, trying to define the characteristics, how we can characterize impact. Impacts may be direct or indirect. The former, the direct, are the so-called primary impacts. The latter, the indirect, are impacts induced elsewhere in space and or later in time. So this may be called secondary impacts. I will give you some example, but I think it is quite clear. A primary impact is, for example, my factory is burning some carbon, so I am emitting CO2. It's clearly a primary impact. My factory needs some material, raw material, to be transported to in order to be worked on, and this is a secondary impact due to traffic transportation. For example, the removal of soils for the construction of an incinerator is a primary impact, and the effect of traffic generated by waste transport is a secondary impact or indirect impact. Our important distinctions are those related to long-term versus short-term impacts. So when you discuss the impact, you shall be able to identify their durations. Are these reversible or irreversible? So if we decommission the system, where are we going back? How much can we go back to the previous situation? And then you shall identify those impacts that are on individual components versus those impacts that are cumulative and so synergistic. So, as we will see later when we introduce the matrix of impacts, the first way of introducing an impact is that of linking an action, project action, toward an environmental component, an individual environmental component, but on more general terms, you may identify more synergetic effects, or synergistic effects, due to the fact that one project action may have a consequence on several environmental components. Synergetic, an impact will be synergetic, elements of or environmental condition able to destroy or enhance the environmental effects of a particular work, may be sensitive to a target, sensitive elements thought to be subject to significant disruption. Again, you understand that when you introduce a concept like an adjective, like sensitive is subjective, meaning that something may be sensitive for somebody and not sensitive for somebody else. Therefore, that environmental impact assessment tools or management tools is that of trying to make the most objective as possible the choices. So to reduce this specificity due to the fact that different experts may experience or may feel a different relevance of the various aspects of a project. This is the Leopold matrix, also called the matrix of impacts. It is very important tool for starting to draft out the environmental impact assessment problem. The classic way of building a Leopold matrix is that of posing environmental components on one axis, let's say the horizontal axis. And the component may be air, water, soil, biosphere, but whatever. And the project activities on the other axis. Here I'm posing the vertical axis, for example, energy production, road construction, or waste transportal, or waste disposal, and so on. When I ask you what is an environmental impact, the good students flashes in its mind the Leopold matrix and answers the environmental impact is the crossing between an environmental component and the project activities. So it is what is contained into this crossing. So we have a matrix, and in each cell of matrix we describe interaction between environmental components and project activities. We will see more about that. I will give you more description because here typically in the Leopold matrix we use two numbers, significance and importance of the impacts. But we will go in details in the subsequent lectures. Important point, you shall remember, Leopold matrix is called matrix of impacts, is a matrix linking environmental components with project activities, and the impact is exactly the crossing of rows and columns in this matrix. When drafting, and we're really going to the conclusion, when drafting the environmental study, we shall think of a model that propose a synthetic representation of a given reality or a schematic representation in order to explicitate a real situation. So when we start with environmental impact study, we build a kind of model, which model is a decision support system, if you want, or decision models. We will see several examples of that in the environmental studies. Then the drafter, that is in general an environmental engineer, should propose environmental components, so items or category of elements that constitute the environment and that are physically definable. For example, biodiversity is an environmental component, physically and numerically describable because there is a number you can measure biodiversity. So an environmental component should be measurable. What is an environmental variable instead? An environmental variable is an element that characterizes the state and dynamics of environmental components that varies in space and times. The environmental variable may be derived by environmental indicators. Environmental indicators are environmental variables that are capable of representing environmental situation not directly measurable through physical units. For example, an environmental indicator may be extended biotic index we have here in Italy. That is a way of measuring the quality of a water body in which you include several elements that may be physical, chemical, but also biological, but not necessarily all directly measurable, but considered together become an environmental indicator. So it is a way of studying an environmental variable. An environmental parameters, a conventional quantity that measures the values taken by a given environmental variable, typically dissolved oxygen or hourly traffic, or if you want, nitrogen concentration and so on. An environmental factor is an environmental component that interacts with other conditioning its states or evolution. For example, chemical physical state of water linked to the process of acidification. So acidification, it is an environmental factor acting on the state of the water body, or in terms of water quality, in terms of chemical physical alteration of properties. An environmental process refers to a transformation of a given environmental reality through intermediate stages, more or less recognizable, determined by a series of internal or external factors. So the environmental process, if you want, is a process in time of changement of some aspect of transformation in time of some aspect of environmental reality. A complex environmental system is the real environment resulting from your interaction of more environmental factors, both that may be natural and anthropogenic. So the complex environmental system includes also the effects of human societies of the quality of environment. Okay, we stop here by today. Do you have any questions? Do you feel I'm too theoretic? Not really, huh? Okay, so we stop. We're here today, and we will continue on next Monday, next Tuesday, with the lecture. Now I stay in the channel for a little bit, for a while, waiting for your questions.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, please.
With regards to the Leopold